every time I start talking to somebody, they start talking and I go, I never thought of that. I'm just doing this because I want to learn. Um, so when I asked you about podcasting, it didn't take us but two sentences to get deep into listening, both as the like, why, what is it about podcasting? Why is Kato like podcasts? How did, what does Kato really think about podcasting? And listening is the thing that you went to really quick. I'm wondering, so you started, I'm going to say your big podcasting journey really started with being a consumer of podcasts, being a connoisseur of podcasts. And can you take me through, at some point that has to become like, you have to become aware of that. At some point, you're just listening to podcasts. I love it. And then some point you're like, you know what? I'm actually getting really good at analyzing or thinking about or making decisions like, man, this podcast isn't for me. This one is for me. Do you remember when you started to become aware that you're deploying your analytical skills to what you were listening to?
Well, and at first, the content I was listening to was like about pop culture or entertainment. I work in the entertainment field as far as theater and things. So that tended to be the thing that brought me in. Uh, and then just finding out the depth of things that were available that people love and they talk about on their podcasts. And we started discovering one that really changed up what we were listening to, my partner and I, the history of English podcast. And it is kind of a very straightforward. He's got this little theme song that plays at the very beginning that is like it's like an 8-bit kind of song. It's very old school, and he loves English language and he goes deep. And he just, the more he did it, the more you could tell just his love and that idea of bringing this passion forward of this one guy talking with his passion, and then it leads to other things. Like he started making books, he became this expert and brought places, and looking at how you can take this thing you love and start bringing it to people that you could never imagine.
Hmm.
And what does that do in this media? And it was, if you could get a microphone and start messing around with it, you can put forward a podcast. And I was fascinated by that. And then, just hearing what people love and then being able to share that also through social media. So I find a podcast that I think is dynamite, and I find people that I think should also listen to it, and I send them the
Ooh, the
link,
connections.
and
Yeah.
we start talking about some of the things that it'll drive conversation in some of my art circles or whoever I'm sharing these things with. Uh, it's just a pretty cool form, and it's something that I could do when I was walking my dogs or doing housework, or if I'm doing chores. In
Hmm.
fact, I get some things done around my house extra because it's like, oh, I want to start listening to some podcasts. I'm going to go recycle boxes.
Yeah. I'm gonna go clean. Right? The only time we ever self-start on that, right? Um, when you mentioned the idea of sharing with other people, I think most people who are podcasters, of course, might first think about sharing their own stuff. But I think the average person would think of that when you say podcast plus sharing. They think of sharing some episode that they discovered. And my mind flashed to, do you know who Hugh McLeod is? The guy from Gaping Void, started drawing little
Yes.
cartoons on business cards, right? Okay, so side note, if you don't know who Hugh McLeod is, go to Gaping Void, Gaping void.com. Wonderful long backstory about the guy in marketing and blah, blah, blah. But one of the things that he talks about comes up multiple times over the years is the idea of social objects. He likes to talk, among many other things, how people don't just get together and talk. They talk about something. Like there's a thing in the middle of the room. And when you said, I love to share podcasts with other people to find people who would enjoy it, to make that connection, that we end up talking about it, then I take it. I'm just like, yeah, you're, and I realize now, oh, I'm doing it too, that I'm seeing the artifact, not just solely as how awesome it is, but also in what it would enable me to do if I shared it with other people. Like, yes, this diamond is cool, but like if I make it a talking piece between me and Kato, then we can have a conversation that we might not have ever gotten around to having before. And then my brain just went meta, like, hey, guess what I'm doing with this show? But anyway, so have you really thought about yeah, geeks in the geeks geeking out over podcasting? Yeah. So was there a question there? No, there wasn't really a question there.
but there is the part that bridged for me from I love podcasts. I've been paying attention to them for a couple of years, and I've been hearing good ones and NPR and their production values and what they do, and then but also hearing these homemade ones like the History of English guy or any of these other little tiny podcast things I was finding
Yeah,
that people are doing
minimum.
out of passion and putting together, organizing their thoughts. And so I was asked a nonprofit theater group that I work with over the years said, "Oh, we've got this little pocket of money. We need to spend it in the next 3 months because their fiscal year would be ending. And is there a project you would love to do and do it with our group?" And I know that they thought I was going to want to put together some kind of show or we're going to do a writing class or something. I said, "I want to learn how to make a podcast." And so I found a podcast that was all about how to make podcasts, and we started listening to it. Well, I remember it was snowing because I was shoveling snow while I was doing these lessons in my ears about like how to make start your own podcast and where to start um, and a couple of things to begin with. And I would learn just enough to then help guide their 5 or 6
Yep.
people from the group who had signed up to also learn. And we were learning together, and I was trying to tell them, I'm learning just enough to be able to come in and lead today's workshop.
I'm only 2 minutes ahead of you, right?
And we did make a podcast and we launched it, and I think we did 4 episodes. It was either 4 or 5 episodes, and we learned a ton of things. We made a lot of mistakes, but we also like our little theme song we put together was great, and we started learning microphone skills. And I realized that a lot of things that I had learned about singing in performance, because you have to have body mics sometimes, or you have to be aware of where microphones are on the stage if you're not wearing them. All these things I had learned about being a performer were helpful with mic skills. Uh, like being aware of breath and being able to hear it because you don't want to breathe into a microphone and things. So that stuff was useful. Also, my ear for stage and rhythm and my editing work in film. I directed a few short films and had learned to edit for that. And that is very much soundscape is so much of what sells a film. It also soundscapes in plays, which you might not be aware of,
Yes.
but a lot of people come to see my plays and they realize that it's also a hearing experience as well as the
Visual, right?
content of what's being said. That I work with actors to fold in how the soundscape. Then they're doing a lot of it with their bodies, and sometimes we're putting things through speakers or and effects that way. But a lot of times it's also just orchestrating how their feet sound on certain surfaces and making that part of the characterization of what we're putting together, because there's an emotional flow to how things sound. And I've been working on that in my work as a playwright for about 2 decades, that rhythm and sounds will convey a message, and it can be contrary to what the actual content, the words we're hearing, but the emotional content is in this other rhythmscape and soundscape that can be separate from the what a word means. It's about what it sounds like and how the
Yes.
words come together, and how you can
I don't-
chop language and break language and begin making emotional sense in a way that even when things don't make cognitive sense, like the sentence structure, but
yes.
there's
Different
this
kinds of
whole other
communication. Yes. Yes. Yes.
understanding.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And so I have that awareness that I'd been cultivating for a couple of decades as a playwright, that when you're only listening and you're isolated and it's only the words that are coming at you, what those things start to mean.
Hmm.
And so I bring that to both when I'm listening to podcasts and how I am interacting with them just emotionally when because it's in my ears. It's an
It's very
intimate
close.
relationship.
Yeah.
It's like this. It's almost like the little voice in my head. It's very close to that. But it's someone else's voice and thoughts or whatever they're creating with this soundscape that moves through that. Yeah, but I got paid to make this podcast with people, and we made it. And then after that, I decided I wanted to get better at understanding. I now had a little view of all the things I didn't know yet,
Hmm.
so I thought I'd go
Yes.
learn more because I enjoy learning things, and I know I can apply it to my work in some way, whether it's going to be making a podcast or doing some other kind of audio project. Because what COVID has done is close
We are all
theaters.
audio producers.
Right. And I knew all kinds of things in the process to help a lot of my playwright friends be able to do readings through Zoom and do other things, because I knew some basics about setting up audio. because of taking 3 podcasting courses that are like, but you don't have a podcast. Well, I know, but it'll come in handy. And then it
Yeah.
did. And also a lot of friends of mine also do audiobook.
Hmm.
They're audio voice actors. And that's how a
Very
lot of them
close,
got
right?
through, have been getting through. They've revved up their voiceover careers. Um, so the audioscape is going to continue. And there's been a lot of discussions in the theater world about what are the hybrid forms that are now going to come out of having spent a year and a half doing audio and with some video productions, but this idea of screen versus live, what do the
Right.
two mean? Those questions have really been asked a lot. And the beginning was podcasting for me.
Sometimes I want to just like slap the headphones off my head and hit stop. And sometimes I want to do a little dance, like I got Kato on recording. I got Kato. Sorry, I'm just a little kid in a candy store. What I so there are so many so many things in there that we could pull on with threads to think about, but I'm trying to like okay, so because you got me all like self conscious here. Well, let's see, if I was a good podcaster, I'd be thinking about what my audience benefit from. So one of the things that you mentioned in there was about and maybe I'm just like pulling this out as an arc that you in what you were mentioning, that you are very aware of what other people are doing when you're listening to a podcast. Like, what did that podcaster do and what was the result? You're very aware of what are all the things that you can do in terms of video editing and audio and production. And then what's the result? And I'm thinking like, all right, well, can you school us some on if we were podcasters, you know, me, everybody else on the other side of this, if we are podcasters, what are some ways that we can begin to do you hear the metaphor about like how do you take a barn down? If you try to do it with a sledgehammer, it's really exhausting. But if you get a crowbar and you start like one board at a time, that's probably a giant blog post that I've read somewhere. You can like if you get the first board off, the rest come off. It's just like you repeat the process. Like it's figuring out where to put the crowbar to get the first board off. So I'm thinking if somebody is going, oh, how do I level up in terms of listening and learning from what I'm hearing? Are there tips that you can think of that would like learn grammar fail, learn my ear, teach me how to be a better consumer of podcasts with an eye toward becoming a better podcaster? Does that make sense?
Yes. And I think
Okay.
it's similar to, because I hear this question from in playwriting too. And part of it is you begin with looking at the podcasts that you do love to listen to, or what is the kind of audio you enjoy consuming. So is it audiobooks or what is that? And listening to them in a deep way where you stop not, and so it's, you have to kind of separate yourself from, there's the content of the podcast or the content of whatever the thing is, and that can be that's your beginning point. But the next thing you need to do is start defining the difference between, okay, I was in love with what it had to say versus how did it bring me through and get me to understand what it had to say. And so you're looking at the mechanism, you're looking at the engine, the mechanism revealed. So how do you then start simply dealing with what the mechanism is separate from the content?
Hmm.
A lot of times when I'm like in some of these classes, it's difficult for people who are coming new to it to see the difference. They tend to respond to the content versus really looking at the structure. Because the thing you can learn to do better is the structure. The
Hmm.
content is something that you're drawn to and people are drawn to it or they're not drawn to it. But that mechanical part is the part you really can start to look at and look at how it was put together and look at those rhythms and beats. And then ask yourself, okay, if I'm putting together my story that I want to convey, what if I use this as a little map and I decide to just take the structure but put my content on a similar structure? What would that look like and what might that be like? And that's the way that you can begin practicing that. Uh, and it's helpful to look at something you're already connected to that someone else has already done that you admire, and then
Hmm.
take it apart, and then just try to take something you're doing and realize. And that's that whole thing. All artists borrow, great artists steal. And eventually you'll be great. And at the point where you're stealing, you won't even know that you're stealing. Kind of, that's part of the secret of
Right.
that too. Like you steal it, but you just go, boom, it's already in your pocket because you're so good and rehearsed at that and practiced at that. But the beginning part of that is taking what you're doing and mapping a story on. An example, which is not podcasting related, but it is story related, is of doing this kind of mapping. Is I have decided I've never liked the story Cinderella my whole life. It's always kind of I get it, but I've never loved Cinderella. But then I realized, oh wow, Cinderella's kind of like she's got a magic older person who tells her things and gives her magic. She has magic crystals and she can talk to animals. She's kind of like a Jedi Knight. She's kind of it's the Luke Skywalker story. And I decided I'm
Mhm.
now doing a version of Cinderella where I'm taking the structure of Star Wars, the 3-act structure that George Lucas created and what the different things are, elements, and I'm putting Cinderella in a story that's the same structure. And while it's not the same story, I'm not stealing a story, but I am lifting like the engine. I'm putting or the machine of the thing, um, to just see what happens if I'm purposeful in that kind of thing. But it's similar with looking at a podcast you might enjoy or an audio production, and then looking at how you can take the thing you want to tell and how do you then borrow that little. You can think of it as a map or as the
Hmm.
underpinnings, the structure, the bones of it, and that's a place to begin. And it will help you start identifying things on your own after just doing it a few times. You'll be able to start pulling out structure options, and then you can reconfigure them too. You can like move things around once you start
Hmm.
practicing it a little bit, just like you would do if you were trying to learn how to create a screenplay or anything that brings us through time. Because just like a movie, just like a or even a book really, but it's longer time because of how you sit with it. All of these story structures that we have are about how do you bring a listener or a viewer through um, through in a one-time viewing this story through time, and how do you use that? I don't know if that made sense, but that's
Yes.
kind of like where you look at it, like how does time factor into it?
Right. That makes
Because
complete
they're
sense.
always telling you things about like timing for your podcast, like, and people are always asking how long should they be. Well, they should be as long as you think you need, but try not to have too much that's extra.
Mm.
Try to start seeing that and pulling that out, because that's when you notice like, oh, oh, they said that already. Oh, or oh, why are they still?
Yeah.
Why am I listening to this part?
Yeah.
And then you notice then you're reminded, like, oh, I just spent 20 minutes on it.
Yeah. Oops.
And it's kind of like the same thing in a play. You don't want to let people lift out of it long enough to realize, oh, I'm watching a play. What am I
It's
doing later?
Thursday. Yeah. What's for dinner? Hmm. I'm torn between taking notes about all the things I should change about my podcasts and trying to continue the conversation. Maybe what I'll just do in this one is just delete my track entirely. So it'll just be Kato giving us, laying down the words.
I don't
Um,
know. Your track though looks pretty great as I'm looking at the signature of it. You got a great setup there. As I'm like, oh, what a great sound wave that is.
yeah, that's it. Yeah. Well, see, I got no content, so I'm just using the engine. That's all I can do is get the technique right, get the
Yay.
technical stuff down. No, in all seriousness, I'm just trying to think if there's any ones like a small thing that I can pull out of all that awesomeness to try and. But I got nothing. I'm completely swamped. I need to go listen to all that again at 90% speed. Um, yeah, I don't know what's a piece of advice that you have heard given to podcasters that's completely wrong?
Well, what an interesting question.
I aim to confuse.
That's completely wrong. Yeah, I think it's just the standard things of, you hear all the different things about what is the. I think most of it's the advice though about when it's ever like not about the listener. Why is the person listening, and why are you telling it? When they're getting around, skirting around really getting somebody to understand why they are making their podcast and getting them to articulate it. It's when they're doing all the other things about the marketing or the how you do the whatever and the stories on Instagram and here's how you promote it. That that whole part of it is so disheartening. I guess so. I don't know that it's about wrong, but it's when they are looking at it as this way of either marketing or instead of, what's the thing you love and what is your why? Because as everybody famously says, podcasting isn't going to make you any money. So so I've learned how to do podcasts and I'm really good at theater. He thinks famous for not making any money. Yeah. Or people who just think the podcast is really going to be, they're just going to get all kinds of listeners. And I listen to people, and then they're discouraged after they've been doing it a couple months and they're not getting listeners. And it tends to be like this idea of, you're trying to let me know about your content and you're trying to get me to press play. But that's not going to get me to press play the second time if I'm not hearing something that I'm interested in, and if there's all kinds of audio problems. Even if I am interested in it, I'm usually going to get pretty frustrated pretty fast. And so part of what I love putting forward is this idea of championing, a culture of championing. Because what gets me to listen to a podcast isn't you telling me to listen to your podcast. It's somebody else telling me, did you hear this? And giving you a reason why. Or when people only post like, here's my podcast, listen to it. But they haven't tailored their introduction to wherever they are posting that in particular. Like, so if it's on a particular message board and it's one where we have personal connections, they use, hey, I've been working on this. I am excited about this because here's why I'm hoping you'll give it a listen. And then when you're maybe putting it on other things that have more of are depersonalized or things where it needs to be a little more businessy, here's a thing that will give you 5 ways to blah, 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 whatever those things are. But to change that interaction, because it's not, I get it. They get it glumped up with marketing. They think they have to market it. But what they need to do is make connections with people wherever they're telling you about it, because that's what the podcast is for, right? The podcast is about making connections with people. Even if it's only you on a microphone, you are still trying to connect your message to that listener, that one listener. And they forget that. They think you're going to be so dazzled by my message, but they're failing to then connect outside of that click idea and really interact with people, because the whole beauty of it is interaction eventually. A click is an interaction. So that's the part. So championing others, because that's what will also help you buy the street credibility. I will consider you credible if you have recommended a couple things and I've clicked and gone, oh, wow, this really is great.
How did I miss
and
that?
Then,
right.
Oh, wow, that was an important thing to hear right now. You are right. That is of this moment. And then I find out that you also, you've got a podcast. I'll check it out because I understand that I can. So you can use other people's things, and then other people are always happy that you share their stuff. And then you build credibility through that. And I think that part gets missed out on, that you being a champion of others enables you to make better work. And it enables you to get your work to the people who might appreciate it. But you build all of that by championing others and making that part of your mission. Like, I know that that's part of my big mission statement. In fact, if I were to write a self-help kind of book or one of those, those, I don't even know what the category is. It's not self-help. You know what I mean? Like
a big idea.
The big idea section of the stories, it would be about creating and maintaining a culture of championing and championing others. Because it makes you feel good. It also eventually makes you look good. I'm hoping that's not the only reason you're doing it, but even if it is, it's a beginning place. And then once you start practicing, though, you do start feeling good. So even if your beginning place is first that kind of more selfish reason, once you start practicing and really doing it, you're just going to get into that, and it's going to feel so good uh, that you continue doing it and incorporate it into how you build your work. And then that invites the kind of people you want to talk to on your
Yeah,
podcast,
it
I
becomes a
think.
self-feeding upward spiral. Cool.
I think so. I find that in the arts community over and over again.
Cool. All right, Kato. Yeah, I mean, we could probably talk for hours, but I don't know. Like, I think, like I said, I'm super excited that we got a chance to talk, and I know everybody will find that as useful as I did. So thanks for taking the time.
You're welcome, Craig. It's so good to sit with you and do this. I had a lot of fun.
Bye.
See you later, Craig.